In Search of True North. This week, we are beginning our new series called Biden B-Sides. When during the election, everyone was talking about Biden and the 94 crime bill and the fact that he said he didn't want his kids growing up in a racial jungle. And I think the only other major thing that I saw people consistently bring up was that he voted for the Iraq War. But in the almost 50 years that he has been in Washington, there's so many other delightfully awful things that he's done. So we wanted to spread a little bit of awareness of the other accolades that he's achieved in his illustrious career. So this week, I tweeted about this earlier this week, but wanted to do a bit of a quick little deep dive with a little more detail. This week, we are covering the RAVE Act. So most people are at least vaguely familiar with Biden's history as a warrior in the drug war on the wrong side of the war. And the RAVE Act is one of his latter day hits, kind of a sleeper hit, if you will. It wasn't exactly a top 10, but it is interesting, and it shows a little bit of the unique psychosis of Joe Biden. So in the early 2000s, Joe Biden was fear-mongering about ecstasy and other club drugs, and he wrote the Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act, which, of course, spells RAVE Act, because he's very clever. Or he or one of his aides. I imagine.
They do that a lot. Like CARES Act stands for, whatever the acronym. Is that what
they obviously reverse engineer it. They land where they want to be and then go backwards. How can we make this make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
So it was co-sponsored by many senators, including Hillary Clinton and current Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. The original bill was voted down, but the Biden team slightly changed some of the wording and rebranded the act as the Illicit Drug Anti-Proliferation Act and got it passed by attaching it as a rider to the child abduction-related Amber Alert bill. So those two bills are not related at all, but he just attached it as a rider to this other bill that everyone was like, oh yeah, when children get abducted, we should have a way to notify people so that we can help save some of these kids. He attached it to that because he knew that was going to pass. And of course, stuff like that happens in Washington all the time, but it's still sleazy. So the point of the bill was, it was written to amend the previous Controlled Substances Act, which was passed in 1970. In the Controlled Substances Act, there was language making it illegal to open or maintain any place that was involved in basically in the drug trade. And Biden's, it was only like 1 or 2 pages, but his act, his RAVE Act, the purpose of it was to strike that phrase, to open or maintain any place, and insert in its replacement the phrase open, lease, rent, use, or maintain any place, whether permanently or temporarily. So what it's doing in that point is really empowering the police to terrorize people even more. For any indication, they might have even been very loosely, indirectly associated with any sort of drug activity. So if you're a landlord and the people that you rent to maybe sold pot a few times out of their apartment, or sold ecstasy a few times in their apartment, or had a party and a bunch of people did ecstasy and the police busted them, you as the landlord could be held responsible as being complicit in those drug activities. That's what that language does, and it's really scary police state bullshit. The second thing that it did was it inserted language that said it was illegal to manage or control any place, whether permanently or temporarily, either as an owner, leasee, agent, employee, occupant, or mortgagee, and knowingly and intentionally rent, lease, profit from, or make available for use, with or without compensation, the place for the purpose of unlawfully manufacturing, storing, distributing, or using a controlled substance. That language is so broad, so pervasive. It's such a huge catch-all umbrella that, like, if you have like a mother-in-law suite on your property and you let one of your friends stay there for a little while and he just does ecstasy there, you could be held liable. And this Joe Biden believed in this so much that he didn't just write an act and introduce it for a vote. When it was voted down, he took the time to rebrand it and attach it to the Amber Alert bill to make sure that it got passed. And then the last thing that it did so if you fall under either of these if you fall under this broad umbrella of people now criminalized by the RAVE Act, you could be, under the terms of the RAVE Act, you could be held to a civil penalty of $250,000 or 2 times the gross receipts, either known or estimated, that were derived from each violation that is attributable to the person, whichever was greater. And this was in the original RAVE Act, and it was also in the rebranded Illicit Drug Anti-Proliferation Act that actually got passed. So again, if your friend that you let stay in your spare room for a few months, if he does ecstasy and the cops bust him, you, as the owner of the house, could be held accountable for a $250,000 civil penalty. Like that would actually be legal under this act. And it was passed because it was written by Joe Biden and it was passed through his political machinations.
Did you ever see anything in your research, Cody, on how often this was enforced? Like how many people how many landlords were busted by this? Or was there any?
I didn't. I know there was one article that I saw that gave a more in-depth look at one person who was prosecuted under this, but I don't know how many times it was used. Mm-hmm. The fact that he thought it was a good idea at all to push for this, I think, is pretty damning, but I don't know how big of an impact it had.
Yeah. This is interesting because, I mean, this is all like, you can tell that it's not necessarily Biden who believes in this, but it's people who were paying Biden to believe in this. No one actually thinks that like this is a good idea to this bill. Like it makes no sense.
I with this sort of stuff, I don't know the extent to which anyone was paying Biden to care about this, and to what extent it was more him trying to stay relevant in Washington. I don't know. Maybe I'm underinformed, or maybe I'm just not being creative enough. But I don't know of a lot of interest other than the military-industrial complex, which over the course of the last 5 or 6 decades has increasingly profited from the militarization of the police. Other than them and police unions, I don't know of a lot of other people who would be pushing for this sort of utterly ridiculous legislation. To me, it seems like Biden just trying to further his career, just trying to stay relevant, trying to fear-monger, trying to keep his image as the guy who's leading, the guy from the Democratic side of the aisle who's leading the fight against drugs. And just to show everybody how much Biden believed in this stuff, I wanted to show a quick clip it's a C-SPAN clip from the early 2000s when he was pushing this law.
If we deal with the consumption side first, or simultaneously, or as heavily, or as firmly as we do the interdiction side and the enforcement side. Let me give you an example. I know of no other drug that I've been exposed to studying that has such a profile in the circumstance under which it's consumed as this drug. You might know that Richie Daley, who I think is one of the best mayors in America, and he is focused on drug problem. I think this turned out to be, this is more of a local problem. If I were governor of my state or mayor of my town, I would be passing new ordinances relating to stiff criminal penalties for anyone who held a rave. The promoter, the guy who owned the building. I would put the son of a gun in jail. I would change the law. But we're afraid to do that because we affect commercial interests. They get kind of shaky when we do that. I would be moving vigorously. It's no, you can ask, my cops are going to come and testify. And you know your folks. There's no doubt about where these raves are. In the middle of the desert. Arrest the promoter. Find a rationale unrelated to drugs. Keeping an unsafe, for example, I'm the guy who authored the crack house legislation. We can use the crack house legislation to tear down these buildings. So I think we better send a message out to the local officials here, to the mayors, the governors, and everybody else, that if you were able to, theoretically, eliminate the circumstances and the places under which raves took place, and or, in addition to which, policed those which on their face are legitimate, you would cut into this in an incredible way, more than if we gave you 500 more DEA agents. Literally, not figuratively, literally.
Yeah, what an idiot.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Like, that's, Jesus Christ. That's,
I can't, I honestly, watching that, I feel rage because he's so clearly psychotic, so clearly insulated from the absolutely horrible effects that this type of legislation that he's pushed his entire career since, well, really since the early 80s at least, the devastating impact that this type of legislation has for the lower and middle class people. And it's so fascist. It's in a cultural sort of way. It's like culturally theocratic, and just no empathy whatsoever for the people that he's going to hurt with this legislation.
Cody, I want to bring up a few things. I'm a little confused. So the Controlled Substances Act was written in 1970.
Yes.
Says?
Under the
and then you said this clip was from the early 2000s?
Yeah. So the RAVE Act was amending language in the Controlled Substances Act to basically make it a free-for-all where police had way more legal leverage to harass anyone even indirectly connected to potential drug use. So in this case, if somebody's holding raves in your town and you're convinced that all the kids are doing ecstasy there and it's a blight on your community, you can actually, what he's trying to do in this legislation is empower the cops to actually harass the landlord and get the whole building shut down. And to even fine the landlord up to $250,000 or two times the amount of money that the police estimate was made from each violation of the law.
Yeah. So what it's saying here is that the DEA began using the legislation that was written in 1970 to then prosecute club owners in the early 2000s. Is that?
Well, the legislation from 1970 had been used all along. What this did was made it even more broad and gave the DEA and local police departments less constraint in how they fought the drug war. And yeah, they started using it after it was passed.
Yeah, what's also funny to me is that the ecstasy is like not like why ecstasy? It doesn't. I'm not like super well versed in the effects that it has on the human body, but I don't think it's anything to. It's not like it's not it's not meth, it's not crack, it's not heroin. No. It basically just makes you feel good. If I'm getting that right.
Yeah, I mean, it does what its name suggests. Yeah.
Yeah. So that even makes it more confusing to me, like what the purpose of this is, and it seems like it's a control thing to kind of expand the police state, expand, what the government has control over. Is kind of
Absolutely.
yeah.
And it's all done. I think it's just done opportunistically on his part. I don't think he gives a shit. I don't think that I think that he just sees this as an opportunity to further his reputation in Washington. I didn't include it in that clip because I didn't think it was as relevant, but it is funny later on in the clip. Biden suggests that the government should start an ad campaign to educate parents that if they find pacifiers in their teenage children's rooms, their kids are almost certainly doing ecstasy. And I just really wish I would have seen that commercial in my lifetime. And it's so funny because this guy who throughout his career has talked about how, we can't afford Medicare, we can't afford Social Security. He wants to spend how many tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars on a national ad campaign about pacifiers.
I wonder
And
what, I don't want to go on a too big of a tangent, but like I'm aware that that was a trend in the 80s and 90s. Was kids thought they were cool.
Well, when you do club drugs like ecstasy, sometimes
Mhm.
it'll have a tendency to make you clench your jaw, and so people would have pacifiers to keep themselves from damaging their jaw while they're out dancing and stuff. And then it also just became like a goofy part of the culture.
Yeah, probably as a result of that. But then what he's saying is that okay, well, now it's all core. Like if any kid has a pacifier, they're probably doing ecstasy, which is hilarious.
I think he said 99% of the time, if your teenager has
Um,
a pacifier in their room, then they're doing ecstasy. It was pretty closely paraphrasing what he said. But yeah, elsewhere in Biden's RAVE Act, he suggested that cops should consider water bottles and glow sticks as drug paraphernalia, which is insane. And I think the last thing that I wanted to say before we close this segment, uh, this is in such stark contrast to how Biden talks about drugs when it's his own family suffering.
Fortune, my son,
and he didn't have a job.
My son, like a lot of people we know at home, had a drug problem. He's overtaken it. He's fixed it. He's worked on it, and I'm proud of him.
But why was he given tens of millions?
My son had a drug problem, but he's worked on it. He's overcome it. He's fixed it, and I'm proud of him. I wish that Joe Biden and all the other drug war zealots had such compassion for the little people who were struggling with drugs.
Yeah, and that's hilarious and not in a funny way. Just the absolute how does that not anger people? How do you not see that? And that this man is someone who has wrote the 94 crime bill is obviously the famous one, but then you see with the Controlled Substances Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act and basically trying to criminalize the use of drugs and also the people who are landlords for the drug users, basically criminalize all of it. And this man has a son who it was using drugs, and his sympathy for his son is admirable, I guess. But then it's just mind blowing that this is the same man who wrote all this. It's so hypocritical. It's incredible.
I think what's his saying that is upsetting to me. But it is also just Joe Biden being Joe Biden. I mean, he is your stereotypical politician who'll say whatever. I mean, he politicized the death of his own wife. But the fact that if like when I was looking at the comment section for this YouTube video, seeing people talk about how that was the most touching moment of the debate, and they were so proud of how Joe Biden took control of that moment, and I was like, this hypocrisy should enrage you.
Right. No. But that's what I'm trying to get at is that they are right in the sense that like if you just listen to him and he was like a super straight shooter, like that moment would bring people to tears. I mean, it was honestly just a very heartfelt moment. And then you learn of all the drug, like you listen to Biden B-sides, and you're like, oh my God, he actually said that in a debate, like basically gathering empathy and sympathy for his son with a drug problem.
And his
And
son
he's the
wasn't just
one
doing
who is
ecstasy.
responsible for so much criminalization of the drugs that his son was doing. And his son was doing worse drugs than ecstasy.
Mhm.
So it's just incredible. It's incredible. Like, and if this doesn't enrage you or sadden you, I guess, like it makes me angry that like people watch that debate and we're so like, if you didn't like Joe Biden now, like that was a hard hitting moment for you. And then you realize all the crap he did in his 47 years. It's insane. So